We're going to start our next unit on tissues, and you probably heard of the term histology before. Histology is the study of tissues. So somebody who's a histologist is somebody who spends a lot of their life looking in microscopes. So we're going to talk all about the types of tissues that make up the human body and the characteristics of each. But first, let's talk about what bodies are made of on the most basic level, and that is cells. And you've heard me say this in class before, but we are a community of cells. And it's hard to think of yourself that way. You know, if you look in the mirror, you see you and you see your personality and you have these beliefs about the world and you're this person, right? But if you really break it down to what we are actually built out of, we're built out of individual cells. And these individual cells manage to work together to make your body run. So we have 50 to 100 trillion cells. So that number, I mean trillion with a T, not billion. And there's at least 260 different types of cells that make up your body. And those cells are constantly working together to make your body run. So again, we've evolved to be at this point. So all those different communities of cells that work together in different parts of your body, they work together on what we call a macro level, which means a large level to make your body run. So if you were to step back and look at yourself and think of all these individual cells working together, the way that our body is able to function is by those communities of cells functioning as a unit. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. But each individual cell is really its own self-contained structure which can function. So this is a bizarre idea, but if I were to take any one of your cells out of your body right now, any one of them, a skin cell, any cell, and I put it into a petri dish and I kept it alive, I removed it and I put it into a petri dish with something called nutrient agar, which is like food for the cells, and water, that cell will thrive. That cell will continue to live, and that cell will also possibly replicate. So that is kind of a strange thing to think about, right? That your cells can actually live without you, but you can't live without your cells. So we're going to go a little bit into that in this section. But the point I'm trying to make here is that even though we are people, and on a large scale, a human is a functioning organism, on a small scale, we can thank our cells for that. So let's talk a little bit more about tissues. What you're seeing right here is an image of a slide, and it is called a histology slide, so it's a tissue slide. And histology is the study of tissues, and you may have heard of pathology before. A pathologist is somebody who studies disease. And what a pathologist does, essentially, is look at biopsies. So they take a piece of somebody's tissue, they slice it thin enough to put it on a microscope, and then they investigate it on if it's normal or if it has a condition based on how those cells are functioning. So what are we looking at right here? This is a cross-section of the respiratory cells. So if I were to go into your nasal cavity or your esophagus, your trachea, that's the air going to your lungs, and I were to look at the tissues on the sides of those cavities, you would see something that looks like this. And the point I'm trying to make here is this is a cross section. This does not have one type of tissue. If you think back to our breakdown of organization of the human body, it goes atoms, right? Atoms make molecules, molecules form together to make organelles, organelles make cells, and then cells form tissues, right? So a tissue is made up of multiple types of cells in the same area which work together. So what you're seeing here is a cross section, and if you take a look, you can see there's a row up here. There's an obvious line right there, right? So that's an obvious line. And then if you take a look here, you can see another obvious line where there's a differentiation between the cells. And then down here, it looks like a total mess, right? Well, what we're looking at here is a cross section of two different types of tissue. This outer layer is made up of something called epithelial tissue. And what you can see is these cells are lined up in more of an organized way, and they're packed in tightly. And then if you look down here, everything that's purple is a nucleus. So that tells you where the cells are. They're dyed purple. The things that are pink, that is going to be non-living material, which is around the cells. So if you look down here, you can see these individual cells are much farther apart. It's not organized. Down here is connective tissue. So one of the things you'll see here is when you look at a slide of an organ, like if I were to take a cross section of any organ in your body, it doesn't have one type of tissue. It has multiple types of tissue with different jobs. So what we're going to talk about in today's lecture is, okay, so we know cells are individual things that work together. How do we keep these cells connected to each other to make tissues? And that's what we're going to talk about now. And those are called intercellular connections. So cells connected to other cells. And there's really three ways in which these cells can form to connect to make tissues, right? So individual cells can form together to make tissues 3 different ways. The first way is called a tight junction. And a tight junction is going to be made to prevent permeability of ions through that junction. And I'm going to explain these in better detail in a moment. But these are when the cells are packed in super tight and nothing can get through. I'm just going to draw you what I think of when I think of tight junctions, right? So tight junctions are, so let's say I have one cell here, and then the next cell is right next to it, packed in tight. And the next cell is right next to it, packed in tight. So these cells are packed in so tight that there's no ability for things to get in and out, right? So think of a membrane. So the membranes of your body, so these are cells, right? They have a nuclei, and they do not allow anything to pass in or out. So they prevent any permeability in, out, or out of that membrane. Okay, so the next type is called a desmosome. And a desmosome is going to be a little bit more specialized. And this is going to be when there's 2 cells that are next to each other, but they allow some permeability. So they allow some things to get in and out. So again, let me just go back to my little diagrams here. So let me draw what I would say if I were to think of a desmosome. Okay, so now we have 2 cells, one here and one here. But what you'll notice is they're not completely packed in, right? There's a space here. And what that space does is it allows for things to get in and out. So think of things like, for example, in your stomach or in your blood vessels. Those cells are packed in, but there's some space there between them so things can get in or out. The analogy I have for that I think is a good one is think about buttons on a shirt, right? So right now I'm wearing a shirt with buttons. Where the buttons are, I can't pull that shirt apart. So it keeps that shirt closed, but there's an opening in between those buttons where air can get in and out. So that's essentially what a desmosome is. It's when there's 2 cells that are next to each other and they're attached, but there's some openings that allow for some permeability. So a tight junction would be like a zipper, right? A zipper zips up and those 2 sides of that shirt are packed in tight and things can't get in or out. A desmosome, on the other hand, does allow for some permeability. So the difference would be in your brain, you don't want things getting in or out of your blood vessels to affect your brain. So that would be like tight junctions. Where in your stomach area, where your guts are, and where you are picking up nutrients, you want some things to get in and out of the blood vessels. So those cells are going to have a little more permeability. And then the third type is called a gap junction. And in a gap junction, both cells allow for the interchange back and forth between them. So the cytoplasms of adjacent or next cells that are next to each other are connected through proteins that allow for transport. So let me just show you real quick what that would look like. So in that scenario, we're going to have 2 cells. So in this case, we have 1 cell here, and then we have another cell right next to it. But even though they look like tight junctions, there are going to be a couple openings. And what that allows for is things to go in and out between those 2 cells. So one cell can influence another cell. And that is important because what that does is it allows one cell to trigger the next cell to react. You're going to see that in your heart, okay? Our heart muscle has gap junctions we're going to talk about. And what that does is it allows one heart muscle cell to trigger the next. And what that does is it allows your heart to beat as one unit because one cell triggers the next cell, triggers the next. Think of whisper down the lane. One person tells the next person, tells the next person. That is called a gap junction. So ions can pass freely back and forth through the cells and allows for things like something called peristalsis, which is how your intestines contract. One intestinal muscle cell is going to trigger the next. This diagram just kind of goes what I went over. You can see tight junctions here would be this example where these cells are attached to each other and they don't allow for any permeability to get through. So this would be the cell here, and then this would be the outside of the cell of the intestines, and this would be the inside of the blood vessel. The tight junction doesn't allow for any permeability. Desmosomes, this is a desmosome. And a desmosome is a protein that holds 2 cells together but allows for some permeability. So the analogy of buttons on a shirt, I think, is a good one. This looks kind of like a shirt button, and it allows some permeability but not much. And then finally, we have gap junctions where one cell is connected to the cell next to it and things can pass by freely. So imagine a room with a door Like if you've ever been to a hotel before, sometimes those hotel rooms have doors in between the rooms where you can go back and forth through the hotel room doors without going into the hallway. So think of gap junctions in that way. And then finally, just to finish off this lecture, we have one more slide, and that is just the tissue types. So there are really, a tissue is a group of cells that have common structure and function. They work together. These cells are held together by these junctions, either tight junctions, desmosomes, or gap junctions, and they form one of 4 tissue types: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nerve. The ones that you're probably familiar with are muscle and nerve and connective, but epithelial is also one of the 4 types. And we'll talk about these all in depth in separate lectures. Thank you very much.